Connor, thanks for joining me. Let's talk about Adolescence. It's a Netflix show about a 13-year-old boy who was arrested on suspicion of murdering one of his female schoolmates. Before we talk about why it was made or anything like that, can you just tell me what the public perception has been of this Netflix show?
It's been, at time of recording, the most watched thing on Netflix for quite some time. It's only 4 episodes. From anything but the clips I've seen, the perception has been that it's well shot, because it's filmed in one continuous shot per episode. It's well acted. It's well written as a self-contained drama. But eyebrows have been raised about comments by the show's creators as to the inspiration from the story. So the main character, and this is Jamie Miller, he's a 13-year-old boy, member of a fictional, let's say, aspirational working class family, married, 2-parent, in Yorkshire. Kind of kid who is more likely to get a non-crime hate incident for dropping a copy of the Quran at school than he is to go on a mass stabbing. And so people were a bit confused as to why there was a focus on this character having killed one of his schoolmates. This is the fictional murder of Katie Leonard for misogynistic reasons, focus on Andrew Tate and the manosphere, rather than the actual inspiration for the story, which, according to the main actor, named Stephen Graham, if I remember correctly, was the murder of a girl called Elaine Andam in Croydon in 2022, and she was stabbed to death at a bus stop by Hassan Sentamu. Now, not quite Jamie Miller, and this guy was from a tumultuous and broken home and had been abused at a boarding school in Uganda. So the assertion that the series is making to millions of people who have watched it and praised it is that because of misogynistic influences like Andrew Tate online, even the quietest, least suspecting white working class schoolboy can be turned into a misogynistic murderer within a few TikToks, rather than, unfortunately, largely ethnic minority boys who, as Rakib Hassan has written about for Spike this week, have a disproportionately positive view of the likes of Tate. The stats he provided from a survey were 41% of black boys, 31% of Asian boys, but only 15% of white boys had a positive view of Tate. The same black boys, of the 46% of children who reach 14 in Britain and don't live with their father, that's 57% of black Caribbean boys, 44% of black African boys, and only 22% of white boys. And black boys and men being responsible for, I think it's about 63% of all knife crime offences, about 61% and 53% of knife crime murders in London. People are wondering why, if that demographic is more likely to commit these violent crimes, more likely to have a favourable view of influences like Tate, and to come from broken homes, why a white working class white boy with 2 stable married parents is the subject depicted in this documentary. And the suspicion is that the focus on the arbitrariness of his indoctrination into murderous misogyny and the need for the state, the school system, social media regulators to contain the social contagion is the real reason it's been picked up and ran with. It's the real reason that there are calls to show it in Parliament, and Keir Starmer has invited the creators to Parliament. It's the real reason it was mentioned at Prime Minister's Questions last week. And now this sudden moral panic about a need for social media regulators like Ofcom, because of the online safety bill, to step in and censor manosphere content.
Right. So we'll get back to sort of whether the main character in this program really should be the archetype of this kind of violence towards women, particularly young and vulnerable girls in our society. But you just touched on it now. There is obviously a moral panic, which has been stimulated by the creation of this, work of fiction, work of art, whatever you want to call it. There have been calls to have this shown in Parliament. There have been calls in Parliament to have this shown in every school in the country, right? That this is a seminal work around which policy should be made, right? It's opened people's eyes up to this new horror of online radicalization. What is the extent of that? And I mean, is that all real, or is that just fluff? Will young boys and girls be having to watch this in their PSHE lessons 5 years from now?
I wouldn't be surprised, because the likes of Lottie Moore and the Family Education Trust have done some extensive research last year into toxic masculinity classes in schools, and they find that the overwhelming number of schools in Britain have introduced kids to phrases like toxic masculinity, and have shown them diagrams including the sort of pyramid of misogyny that starts off at the bottom with traditional gender roles, protector and provider, and ends at the top in rape and domestic abuse, as if there's some kind of ineluctable relation between the two.
It's kind of like what we saw with the sort of Sarah Everard case, where that young lady was murdered by a crazy police officer.
Yeah, Wayne Couzens, who's
exactly.
a known predator within the police.
Yeah, and then suddenly you had people in parliaments talking about how bullying in schools and young boys bullying people in schools would lead to psychotic rape and murder.
Yes, as if somehow a notorious sex criminal and flasher is emblematic of the general opinions that men have of women in this country, which I find reprehensible, and that
there's a conveyor belt from one to the other.
Yeah, exactly, as if there's a sort of deterministic trend between wanting to look after your wife and children and then going out and abducting, raping and murdering random women. And the reason I think this is the sort of direction of travel for education and the government at large is because last year, as I reported on for Courage Media, the former government anti-extremism advisor Dame Sarah Khan teamed up with Home Office funded communist activist group Hope Not Hate to produce a report about the trends of violent extremism in the country, and it focused myopically on conspiracy theories, the far right, and manosphere misogyny. And she advised that new government departments be made in the Cabinet Office and the Department for Education to surveil people like Andrew Tate, named specifically, and to create the kinds of toxic masculinity, anti-manosphere lessons using the PSHE, sex and relationships education lessons, which the Conservatives in their era made mandatory in, I think it was 2020, and to educate young boys into opposing misogyny as they define it. Now, the two problems I have with this: first of all, I won't take lectures from this government on lessening misogyny when they are en masse importing men from cultures which put the burden on women to dress so they would say modestly, but let's say repress them in head-to-toe burqas and niqabs, to constrain the violent sexual appetites of men in those countries. Like, if you're going to import misogyny, don't give me lessons on misogyny. And the second thing I would say as well is one of the scenes which has been made into a meme online from the show has been a female teacher sitting down and subjecting Jamie to a kind of struggle session. And it's meant to be cathartic in this. This has generated all the sort of Newsnight responses of why don't men cry more? And let's go talk to Caitlin Moran, demented feminist who hasn't held a healthy relationship together, about what's good for men. But in this scene, this teacher slowly, with a stone face, breaks down Jamie's defences until he is reduced to tears. And my former colleague, Carl Benjamin, actually had a very good take on this, which is, although this is a very extreme example of it, this is the worst kind of approach to boys and men who might be trending in the direction of Tate, because all you're doing is you're presenting them with an ambassador of all they think is toxic and powerful about femininity. 75% of teachers and school staff are women. Again, I've got those in my family. Many of them do a good job, but it does mean there's an absence of male role models, particularly for those young boys, as I've already said, almost half of in the country, who don't have a father figure at home. And so if they are day in, day out in a school environment where they are told to sit still, shut up, pay attention to things that they're not interested in, they can't work out the differences from other boys in the playground with physical violence, aggression or competition because they're told it's toxically masculine, and then when they act out, they are told to sit down and work through their feelings in a verbal way until they're reduced to tears, it doesn't suit their intuitions. It's just going to frustrate them further. It's going to make it like they're not being listened to, and actually push them more towards the exact kind of extremism that these classes purport to be so worried about and want to eradicate. So it's counterintuitive, and I don't think the government has a good plan nor credibility on this issue.
Right, so we have this debate about positive male role models, and it seems that all the media class can sort of conjure up sort of celebrities, male celebrities crying. And you mentioned, and I think the Rakib Ehsan spiked article, which you mentioned just now, did bring up this question of lone parent households, the figures relating to fatherlessness in the country. And it seems remiss of our political class not to mention this when we're talking about boys needing sort of stable homes and good examples, which they would find, not sort of scouring the internet for strong men who have lots of girlfriends and, get up to sort of fairly attractive, seemingly attractive hijinks.
Well, not just attractive.
Because Andrew Tate is the bogeyman everyone is referring to.
Yeah, right? and he is gross. I mean, I would like to state that for the record. I've often called him a pimp turned imam. I don't think he's a credible voice on what is and isn't masculine.
And he's being investigated for all sorts of sexual offences, human trafficking.
Yes.
At the moment.
Yeah, and whether or not those are credible, it's not the best role model in the world to have that hanging over your head at all. Let's put it that way. I think there are probably other people that young boys could look up to that don't have those kind of charges hanging about them. But point being, as you've alluded to, in lieu of Andrew Tate, what role models are they providing? And they're not. Instead, they're either putting up these blubbering, socially incontinent messes, which I think it was Christina Hoff Sommers once said, the education system is presenting to convince boys that they're somehow defective girls, and they've just got to be more feminine in order to rid themselves of their toxic masculinity, kind of absolve themselves of the sin. And also, they're not encouraging the kind of family cohesiveness that is a bulwark against boys acting out in this way. In fact, in this series that's being promoted, they're presenting it as an insufficient way of stopping it, because any boy at any time could be ideologically captured by Andrew Tate and go and stab a bunch of girls. And I will say the reason for this, and it's going to be uncomfortable to say, is because stating that a heterosexual married couple is the best thing, at least the ideal thing for a child to be raised in, indicts the project of absolute freedom without consequences that both the socialists and the liberals have embarked on since the Enlightenment. Because if they turn around and say, well, we're going to try and encourage stable two-parent families, then it's going to turn around and say, you're being homophobic because you're opposed to two mums raising a boy through surrogacy, or you're keeping women in abusive relationships because here are these marginal cases where no-fault divorce have kept a few women in abusive relationships, and obviously that's tragic, whereas the overwhelming number of divorces, which spiked after the passage of no-fault divorce in America and the recent passage in the UK, are for reasons to do with the parents' emotional compatibility or their lifestyle, and the needs of the children are always subordinated. Katie Faust is very good on this. If you try to push policies that actually prevent this kind of stuff, of boys becoming violent, acting out, joining gangs, looking for father figures in lieu of having a dad in the home, you indict that project of unalloyed adult freedom. This is the stuff that Miriam Cates has been talking about, for example. Miriam Cates has been saying about the need for a ban on smartphones for under 16s because of the likes of boys being exposed to pornography between ages 8 and 11, and now the overwhelming number of sexual assault cases in this country are actually child on child, with pornography being cited in over 50% of the cases. But now the smartphone ban has been seized upon after the production of Adolescence, with Guardian journalists writing, well, we finally need to pay attention to this. We didn't care when it was TikToks indoctrinating young girls into transgenderism and sterilizing them, but we now care when young boys are watching Andrew Tate clips. So again, they don't want to deal with these problems because, one, it indicts their ideological project, and two, they're only adopting previous solutions which have been provided by people that actually did care, now that it's politically convenient for them, and they have the boogeyman of Andrew Tate to blame.
But what degree do you think that this is sort of reducing certain social problems to health and safetyism, couching everything in terms of sort of like online harms, to which the state then has to step in to manage social relations, to step in to the role of the father figure? You mentioned sort of unadulterated freedom on the one side, but you also have this sort of statist approach to managing social relations, which this seems to come down to as well.
I think it's a bit chicken and egg. So there is a degree of using adolescence to manufacture consent for expanding state power and enacting censorship laws that they always wanted to do anyway. We've seen this with other forms of media. Peter Hitchens in Abolition of Britain documented how Tony Blair had mentioned Deirdre from Coronation Street's false incarceration in the 90s in conjunction with policing crime and courts reform. Then we had, in 2022, a Coronation Street storyline about a young autistic boy called Max being groomed by the far right, and also a mention of grooming gangs, but the grooming gangs were run by a white property developer and a white policeman as well. Absolutely no mention of the predominantly Pakistani Muslim perpetrators at the time, kind of brushing it all under the rug and increasing the scaremongering about the far right lurking around every corner. We had last year an ITV drama called Breathless to do with the COVID pandemic that depicted the NHS as racist because it was marginalising the concerns of foreign doctors who were raising the alarm about this the entire time, pinning it all on the government for not locking down faster, further, earlier. There was also Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which then kicked into gear the Post Office inquiry. And of course, those postmasters are underserved, but the fact that it took a TV drama to instigate that shows that we're basically governed by Netflix.
Well, this is interesting, right? I mean, so the Post Office inquiry, that was kicked off on the basis of no real new information. And it seems that for our sort of, boomer political class, the only way in which something is real and can be dealt with is if it exists in the sort of pop cultural media sphere. And until it's filtered through that, it doesn't exist. We have the data.
Yeah. A friend of mine once said, for boomers, the TV is a primary sense organ. And I think that all of this is proving it true. So there is an extent to which this is, propaganda to justify what the state wants to do anyway. But also I think it's a cleanup effort because, as we've already stated, the predominant fans of Andrew Tate are young, first and second, even third generation immigrant children, mainly from black or Muslim households. And what's happened as a result of increasing ethnic diversity and demographic fracturing is that by proxy, culture has fractured too. We see this with increasing levels of Islamic radicalism as documented by the Henry Jackson Society in their polling last year, which found that views like 52% of Muslims wanting depictions of the Prophet Muhammad outlawed, or about 75% thinking that Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th, is mainly concentrated among university-educated, second-generation British-born Muslim males, 18 to 30. And so what we're seeing is a censorship of the internet, a suppression of the public square, in order to manage the organic cultural fracturing and the deleterious social and criminal consequences of the immigration policy that is still being continued by the government that's trying to clean up their own mess. So there's a little bit of, we're trying to engineer more powers that we already agree with, and a little bit of, oh hell, we've now got this unexpected problem that our ideology doesn't allow us to admit to. Let's clean it up quickly in the only way we know how, which is totalitarianism.
Okay, and then I think finally on this topic, there's the interesting question about why we are spending so much time focusing on young boys. There's tremendous amounts of data showing that young girls have increasingly become radicalized, particularly to the very, very, very far left in a lot of Western European countries. Young men still seem to vote roughly in line with the average of the population. And I have a graph here from Germany, which we can put up on the screen. Women have deviated, young girls under 30 have deviated very, very far to the left. There doesn't seem to be any conversation about radicalization in that area.
So I think, if I'm correct, it was about 25-point swing from the population average towards Die Linke, the Communist Party, in Germany among young women, and it was only a 4-point swing towards the AfD from young men. The only country that isn't really seeing this level of polarization as projected was actually America, where young men and young women actually swung towards Trump, at least young white women, young black women, particularly young college-educated white women as well, aren't big fans of Trump, but still, in aggregate, it's healthier there. I think the reason we're not seeing it is because women are now the foot soldiers of the regime. They're a regime client group. The reason that, as well, a young white boy was depicted here with no sympathy for his plight, despite the fact that young white boys are the worst performing in education and employment now. The gender pay gap, as it was previously touted, even though it was basically a myth because it didn't account for hours worked, seniority of position, etc. But the gender pay gap, insofar as it exists, has inverted for young men and women. Young women are now far out earning young men, and this is a problem because lots of young women, of course, want a young man who is earning well in order to get married to him, and so this is actually cutting off women's dating options at the knees, which is tragedy for both sexes. Young men are outnumbered at university. They are underperforming in terms of school readiness and grades at GCSE and A level compared to young women, but there's no sympathy shown towards them because their opposing identity groups in this sort of oppressor-oppressed framework are the regime's client groups. And so the young black and other minority ethnic boys who favour Andrew Tate, who are more likely to commit violent crime per capita, who have broken homes, well, we can't criticise them or the lifestyle choices of their parents because they're an oppressed minority. So we can't actually acknowledge the problem. We can't criticise young women because their left-wing politics are derivative of their pursuit of unalloyed freedom, which is the provision of equal material goods, the provision of abortion on demand, the war against biology that is transgenderism. We can't criticise any of that because imposing any criticisms on those ideas are a form of oppression, and again, young women are furthering the regime's revolution. So the only acceptable group to criticise is young white boys, even if this fictional example doesn't really jibe with reality.